Thank you all for joining us today. Excited to bring you what we think is a unique conversation discussion from a couple points of view, a little bit different from, I think, what we're all hearing when we talk about cybersecurity, responding to incidents. There's a lot around it. And what we tried to do for this particular discussion is bring in professionals from a number of different areas. From a legal perspective, from an information security perspective, and from an insurance perspective, pre-incident, during the incident, and post the incident. And again, and what we want to try to do is leave you valuable or we say influential information, right? We want you to be able to take what's in this discussion, continue discussion with these folks, and be able to make decisions that can help out you and your organization. In this particular area, which of course we know is very high touch. So excited to spend some time with you this morning. Before we get going, I do want to thank the Fang, the Financial Executive Networking Group, and Joyce Gibney for all your support and allowing us to put this presentation on this morning. Just briefly about the Fang, it's an amazing group. It's an internationally recognized organization for senior financial professionals. Members currently hold titles such as CFO, Treasurer, Controller, Managing Director. We have close to 40,000 members, representing over 15,000 companies, both public and private. Member companies include corporations and financial institutions. And what's really unique about the Fang is not only the locations, which is spread out throughout the country and of course globally, we have close to 30 plus special interest groups. The interest group that we're a part of, that I'm a part of, that I chair is the risk management group, and it kind of runs into the insurance group as well. And what's great about it, everything is organized by industry or financial expertise. So be it risk management, treasury, tax, private equity. So I encourage you to please go to the Fang's website. Any questions, you can reach out to Joyce or myself. But again, it's a wonderful organization, and they're allowing us to put this on for you all today. So with that being said, I'd like to just maybe do some brief introductions for our group that's with us today. We'll start maybe to my left. Does that make sense? Sadi, is that okay? So we have Troutman Pepper representatives. We have Alliant representatives and Avertium representatives as well. So again, a little bit different from your typical panel of having, say, one or two people. We have a little bit larger group, but it's going to make, I think, for a pretty impactful discussion. So Sadi, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sadia Mirza. I am a privacy and cybersecurity attorney at Troutman Pepper. I obviously have a background in incident response, so helping clients respond to security incidents. I also have a lot of experience with privacy compliance, and my practice is pretty much split like 80-20 at this point between those two things.
David Finz, pleased to be here. I'm with Alliant. I have been with Alliant for about coming up on 2 years now. I have 17 years in the insurance industry, and I'm also an attorney by training. My role at Alliant is to assist our clients with cyber claims and also with policy wording.
Yeah, thank you, David.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kamran Salour. I'm a data privacy and cybersecurity attorney at Troutman Pepper. Like Sadia, my practice focuses on helping organizations respond to all types of data security incidents, and often I work with insurance companies as well as forensic firms in that process.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Mike Wilkinson. I am the director of the cyber response unit at Avertium, basically heading up the team that responds to and investigates security incidents, and been doing that for about 19 years now, with experience in law enforcement and the private sector, and a little bit of time in academia as well.
Thanks, Mike. Dara, are you in or no?
I'm handling the questions.
Handle the questions, okay. And Dara Gibson is with us as well from Avertium. And yeah, so again, action-packed agenda. Let's hop right into it. Mike, maybe if you could.
Jared, I'm sorry. How would you like the audience to handle any questions they have?
Yeah, so if we can use the chat box, Joyce, or the message box, that'd be great.
Okay.
Yep, and also I'm glad you mentioned that too. Please, for everyone that's on the call, if you can just put your information, feel comfortable enough, your name, email, phone number. Right. Again, this is an opportunity for us all to kind of network and takes this discussion not just from today, but moving forward. If you have any questions, you can get a hold of these guys. So please feel free to put your information into the chat box as well as your questions. All set, Joyce?
Yeah, all set.
Good. All right, good. All right, so Mike, why don't you take us off here, kick off the discussion, because this is important. We talk about a case study, handling an incident without insurance. I know you have an example or two around a particular client that you've helped and worked with. If you could talk us through that, and I think that'll set up a good precursor to the rest of the conversation.
Yeah, sure, Jared. And the sort of case study I've got in mind, and I've been doing this for a few years, and one of the challenges I have is there's lots of investigations I've been involved in. This one's kind of memorable for a number of reasons. Firstly, it was a manufacturing organisation, and they were hit by ransomware. We sort of got the call after everything had been encrypted, and they had good network segmentation going on, which we'll be talking about in a little bit, but basically they had a corporate network, and then they had their manufacturing network. Manufacturing, all IoT, if we want to use the latest buzzword. And then it was primarily their corporate network that was affected. A few of the control systems were also affected, which basically stopped their manufacturing dead in the water. So they were a 24/7 manufacturing environment. So obviously the cost for them was significant and really measured in, I think it was tens of thousands of dollars every hour. And then when we started getting involved, having a look around the network, they had a number of challenges, shall we say, with their environment. They didn't have good backups. They had the good segmentation between the corporate environment and the manufacturing, the IoT environment, but they didn't have much access control, weren't using multi-factor authentication or anything else on the corporate side. So the threat actor was able to get full domain admin access to that corporate network actually very easily. And then had pushed out ZooSpot or ZBot around the network, which is a bot that actually, or a Trojan that spreads between computers automatically. So what was happening is, as they were cleaning one system, it was putting it back on the network. There were still other infected systems on the network, and they were all getting reinfected. While this was all going on, they're madly trying to get the manufacturing side up and running, which in the end, they decided that the best approach was actually to pay the ransom to just get things back up and running as quickly as possible. The ransom started out at $20 million. We managed to get it down to $5 million. And this company didn't actually have insurance. So they were paying not only for the loss of business continuity, but also for the cost of the ransom. So immediately a fairly significant amount of money there, as I'm sure you can appreciate. It was a fairly large organisation, but that $5 million was still a fairly significant amount for them. Having negotiated the ransom, we then obtained the decryptor and were able to start restoring systems and getting their data back online, which then allowed them to start getting that manufacturing process back up and running again. In terms of the costs for them were significant. There's obviously a lot of costs in that downtime with manufacturing, a lot of challenges bringing those sort of systems back online and getting them restored, cost of consultants coming in, and we're assisting not just in conducting investigation, but also in getting their systems back online. And then obviously $5 million worth of ransom.
Mike, question for you. How often do you see the ransomware, I guess we call it demands, negotiated, or how willing that party who's conducting or did conduct the breach, and maybe they're still in there, as this is all unfolding, you see that negotiation, or is it a hard demand and that's it? Quite a bit, but what's your...
Yeah, no, we do, and certainly any engagement we're involved in, we will negotiate and we'll always negotiate most of the time, and it's changed over time. That whole ransomware market, if you will, has changed pretty significantly over probably the last 3 years. And I would say at this point in time, they're probably more open to negotiation than they have been in the past. And a lot of that negotiation is based on the sense of urgency that you have as in any sort of negotiation situation. So if you're in a situation where you're able to restore most of your system from backup, and you can say, well, we've just got one critical system, then you can start arguing, well, we need the decryption key for this one particular system.
Yeah.
And things like that you can use to help bring that price down.
Interesting. And I know and we'll speak to it in a little bit. You mentioned controls a few times, or requirement, let's say controls that organizations, firms need to have in place. There's a handful of them, right? We know double digits, close to about 18 or 20, but I know there's essential ones where that return may be a little bit greater to their bottom line by having them in place. So, we'll look forward to chatting about that a little bit more. Maybe if we can, and thanks, Mike, maybe we can go to the next area there. Okay, so let's talk about pre-incident. And obviously critical to have things in place beforehand. And we know that's not always the case, which again can result in a lot of damage, not just financially. David, maybe if you can speak to the benefits of cyber insurance, and then Sadia and Kamran, you guys can maybe piggyback off of that. I think it'll give a good sense to the audience of how legal and insurance are interconnected and working together to help folks pre-incident, putting things in place. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Jared. So cyber insurance is designed to pick up both the out-of-pocket, or as we call it, first-party costs associated with responding to a cyber incident, as well as any third-party costs, such as defense costs or responding to a regulatory inquiry or settling any of those matters. Now, not every cyber incident results in third-party costs, but that coverage is part of the policy typically. So going back to Mike's example, right? If cyber insurance had been available to this particular client, what that would have covered, for starters, would have been engaging privacy counsel to sort of quarterback, if you will, the incident response here, bring in the vendors, make sure that any reporting requirements are complied with, any notification to affected parties, but also to try to protect privilege with respect to any communications or work product that arises out of this. So privacy counsel would then engage a firm like Avertium to come in and assess the situation. There may be forensics investigations involved, and there may be threat consulting work. They're going to try to determine whether the incident can be resolved without having to negotiate a ransom payment. So for example, if there's a decryption key available, then if necessary, they'll negotiate with the threat actor, get that number down as low as possible, and then arrange for payment of the ransom, which is also covered by this insurance, provided that the payment is not being made to a sanctioned individual or entity. So that's, again, just with respect to the example that was provided here. Mike also mentioned the fact that the business suffered lost income and extra expense. The cost associated with the business interruption is also typically covered under a cyber policy, as is the cost of having that quantified and bringing in a forensic accountant to determine how much the loss really was, to basically, as we say, prove up the loss. So just for that one example, those are all the different services that would be picked up under a typical cyber policy.
Good. Thanks, David. And maybe Kamran, before we get into, how does a business benefit from having a well-tested IR plan, can you just shed a little light as well, maybe some supporting context around the benefits of cyber insurance and how that works in parallel, I guess, with David?
Absolutely. And as David mentioned, right, one of the primary benefits of having cyber insurance is coverage of the event and the incident. But I think beyond that, one of the maybe overlooked benefits of having cyber insurance is it really allows the appropriate people to be involved really at the outset of the incident. Now, in Mike's example, they lucked out. They called Avertium. Avertium is a very skilled forensic investigation firm, and they know how to handle an incident response. But a lot of times, the impacted organization will just contact an IT person that professes to have experience in forensics, but really doesn't. And that when you go to a non-expert in this process, you lose valuable evidence, you lose valuable information, and you really don't get the benefit of having the right people involved, and as well as having the people who are familiar with one another. This is a process where insurance, legal, and forensics are often working together. There's a lot of interplay and a lot of back and forth, and having people within those three separate sectors that have experience working with one another I think really helps streamline the process, makes it efficient, and makes it as painless as possible for the impacted organization.
That's great, Cameron. Very helpful. I love how you said it too, really interplaying, working off each other. Mike, is there anything else you want to add to that at all, from your perspective, or?
Yeah, from our perspective, I would say we do run into incidents, and probably even 50% of our cases, sort of clients come directly to us and frequently engage us without engaging counsel first. And it's actually quite common that they'll engage us, immediate response. We have to stop the bleeding, the business is directly impacted. And then they think, we'll go and sort out the insurance later, we'll sort out the legal stuff later. And that, can end up costing them a fair bit of money in the long run, especially cyber insurance. It always surprises me when people quite often will have an insurance policy, but maybe the IT team is reaching out to us to try and fix the problem. Finance or the risk team has actually taken out the policy. Nobody really knows who to get in contact with, and they're not taking advantage of all the resources they get through that insurance policy.
Yep, great, very helpful too. And also, it's interesting in our world on the insurance side, having a policy that responds, when triggered, understanding the language that's in there. And again, to understand the language, it's working not just with your internal legal team, but it's working with outside counsel as well. And maybe to the next area, Sadie, if you want to touch on, we talk about, why does an organization need reasonable security, and how do you achieve that? Can you just touch on what is reasonable? And then maybe we can take the discussion from there.
Yeah, so when talking about reasonable security, that's a concept that comes from the law itself, right? There's various laws that tell organizations they need to maintain reasonable security. And then the question always comes up, well, what does it mean what does reasonable mean? And unfortunately, most of the laws do, well, fortunately, I would say there's a benefit to it. It doesn't define what reasonable is. Because the truth is, what's reasonable for one organization is going to look very different in terms of what's reasonable for another. So if you take like a startup, for example, compared to Microsoft, right, their security level is not going to be the same. It's going to depend on the size of the organization. It's going to depend on the types of data they collect. So are you collecting just name and address, which is more publicly available, or are you collecting financial information and social security numbers that might warrant heightened information security procedures? It'll also depend on, what's commercially reasonable and the resources available to the organization. And so, I say unfortunately, but fortunately, there's a good reason why it's not defined, right? If it was very defined program, it wouldn't work. And it'd probably hinder a lot of people from coming up, right? Because you can't be expected to have that level of security right away. And so with that said, though, there are standards and frameworks in place that a lot of organizations leverage that guide them in terms of how to set up their information security program, but they can adopt the portions of it that make sense for them. And I know just based on those guides, coming from an insurance perspective, I know there's certain, the low-hanging fruits, I guess, that, insurance requires organizations to have in terms of certain controls. And maybe, Mike or someone's going to be better equipped to talk about those.
Yeah. Oh, thanks,
Before
Sonia.
we move on to the controls, we had one question come in regarding, Bob said, I think you mentioned first and third party impact. What is second party insurance?
That's sort of a misnomer, right? I mean, they call it first and third party. Really, the first party is the out-of-pocket cost. The third party is, any external demand, regulatory inquiry, complaint that you receive. So for purposes of coverage discussion, there is no second party. That's just a nomenclature that's
Could generally be the insurance company as
is the second party, right? Is the one that's actually providing the coverage.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's, it's an excellent question. It's one that I know, David, I'm sure you get it quite a bit. I get it quite a bit. So, yeah.
The insurance geeks use these terms as if they're
try to confuse you as much as possible. I know. Yeah, no. No, thank you for the question. Okay, yeah, Sunny,
I was
go ahead,
going to
please.
say one thing, and I think, Cameron, this is basically what you said, very similar in terms of the benefits of cyber insurance. And Cameron, I think that's just a different way of phrasing it. To me, the benefit of the cyber insurance is having the availability of the experts, but for a lot of insureds or clients, they don't know what to do in the event of an incident, right? And the moment you contact your carrier, right, you basically initiate a process. You've triggered your agent's going to contact counsel, your counsel's going to contact the forensics, but all of that's going to be taken care of for you, right? They're going to make sure the right people get into place as quickly as possible. And for me, if I was a business knowing that, okay, well, my job is just to contact this one person, and then that's going to set the process on fire, basically, right? And that to me is a huge value because businesses don't know what to do. And cyber insurance makes sure that you follow the process, and it matters a lot from a legal perspective, especially when you start talking about litigation and regulatory inquiries. They're going to ask you, did you follow this, this process about what typically happens in an incident, if it makes sense for you? And so that to me is one of the greatest benefits of cyber insurance, is guiding your insured through that process that most people never go through.
The service providers are lined up for you. They have been vetted by the underwriters. Their rates are pre-negotiated. There's a lot of advantages to availing yourself of the panel of experts that the underwriters have assembled. And then, of course, some organizations prefer to use their own vendors, and there's a process by which we can get those approved too. But the panel is a great starting point for most businesses when saying, okay, I don't even know who to bring in to deal with this incident. And, one call to the hotline set up by the insurance carrier gets that process in motion.
And I think that underscores the point of the benefit of testing your incident response plan, because to Mike's point, sometimes people will have insurance, but they'll just call him directly. And that's probably because they didn't go through a test to see what's the first step they should do. One of the first steps in your incident response plan should be to contact your cyber insurance, to the extent you have cyber insurance, because that will set off the process. And so if you don't test it, you don't know that, you eliminate a lot of that confusion by going through that testing process.
Absolutely.
That's good. And David, too, not to harp on it too much here, but is it possible to bind a preferred vendor into your policy?
So the process by which ideally this takes place is a client comes to us and says, we understand that there's 5 or 7 law firms that, the underwriters have on their panel that they want to use, but we have this great firm and they helped us draft our privacy policy and they really, know our business. We'd like to have them added. In that case, we can go to the underwriters and have that firm vetted and added to the policy by endorsement. Now, there's 2 caveats with that. One is they're not going to pay this off-panel firm a higher rate than they're paying the firms that have already agreed to be on the panel. So do keep in mind, if you prefer to use your own firm, there may be something of a delta between the rack rate and the reimbursable rate. The other point is, just because you add a law firm to the panel, keep in mind, they are often engaging the other vendors. So that law firm needs to be mindful of what forensics investigators, what PR firms, threat consultants, credit reporting agencies, all that are pre-approved on that insurer's panel. So they need to acquaint themselves with that so that they are engaging firms that will also be covered under the policy.
It's an excellent point. I mean, and that's a lot too. Right? I mean, that's a lot to handle.
So they need to be
Yeah.
apprised of
Yeah.
that. And that's why
Yeah.
it's good to test your incident response plan in advance.
Right,
do
right,
a
right.
Tabletop.
Right. Okay. That's great. Now, and I know, Mike, you touched on it earlier. We talked about cybersecurity controls, and we can, there we go. And there's about 18, give or take, right? But I know you talked about briefly. There's core controls that you need, essential ones that you need, where you'll get that highest return of investment within your business if you have in place. Can you touch on a few? Maybe not all of them,
Yeah,
but a few of the essential ones, since we have a lot there on that slide.
certainly. Yes, I won't bore everyone with a few hours of
Very
security
exciting
controls.
circles. Yeah.
But and absolutely. I mean, there's a few things, and when we talk about controls, they're serving 2 functions. Primary function, making sure that people can't get into your environment. Then, in the event that they do get in, limiting the access they have. And the amount of damage they can do once they're inside. And then finally, it's actually being able to investigate and figure out what went wrong in the event someone does finally get in there. So in terms of the controls, and what we've listed here are some of the ones that really provide sort of best return on investment. They're relatively easy to implement. And again, relative, I'll stress the relative side, but they are generally fairly straightforward to implement. And they are either going to give you really good defense, or give you really good access to containment, once something does go wrong. And multi-factor authentication, for me, is an absolute no-brainer. You have to have that in place.
Absolutely.
There's just absolutely no reason in this day and age why you wouldn't have multi-factor authentication on everything. EDR, enterprise detection and response tools, miles ahead of sort of where antivirus was, or still is. I don't want to get into a debate between all those definitions and differences, but endpoint detection and response tools allow you to detect and block malicious activity, but they're also monitoring everything that's going on. In the event that something suspicious happens, it allows you to really quickly see, what program triggered this network connection that we're suspicious about, or we see this bit of malware that was launched. We actually get to trace it back and see what was the initial program that triggered all of that happening. Oh, look, we can see someone, opened Outlook, which opened Word, and then we start seeing a connection out to the internet from Word. That shouldn't be happening. We can now go back to that user and have a chat to them about email hygiene, which these days is honestly, phishing is probably the most common point of compromise. And that security culture training, that email hygiene, is hard. And in terms of, challenges, certainly from my perspective, I'm a geek, so the technical stuff comes easy to me.
Sure.
You have a bit of a background in education as well, but the training thing is to me the hardest part, and creating that culture of security training. But that is something that is absolutely critical.
Yeah, it's essential. So, and I think the volume too. I mean, obviously the larger corporations get, we could probably speak for our firms, the volume, the amount that we get, and as I guess called employees or members of the organization, to stay on top of what needs to be weeded out, what needs to be, flushed out to IT. It can be challenging. Sometimes it may seem easy. We sit in these corporate trainings, you're like, oh, all right, phishing, I know what to do. But more times than not, it's the amount of volume and how it's done is very clever. From a legal perspective, Sadia, Kamran, anything else you want to touch on? I guess not, so to speak, speaking to the actual, circles there, but the meat and potatoes of how you all can help as well.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, no, so I was going to say, so information security, it's a journey, right? It's a journey, and it's going to look different for every organization. And so, when I look at these controls, I think that, okay, not every organization is going to have all of these, even these 10 in place right away, right? The controls, the safeguards that you select are going to be based on the risks to your organization, and then you prioritize those risks and you figure out which controls and safeguards you need to address those, right? And so even though, everyone talks about MFA, and I'm playing a bit of a devil's advocate here, for some organizations, depending on the data they collect, they may not necessarily, maybe that's not where their risk is and they don't have MFA in place. But that's okay, because they've looked at their information security program as a whole and decided that there's other areas of risk they need to address first. And, maybe that's just part of the roadmap. So, that's real. That was my takeaway from listening, is that it's always a journey. It's going to look different for organizations. And again, it's based on your risk, right? That's how you decide what controls you need in place.
Based on your risk profile. Yeah.
And for me, it underscores the need to have cyber insurance, because there are so many different controls. And at the end of the day, we always have that human element. And so no matter what you do from a security standpoint, and as much training as you do for a phishing exercise, let's say, it's almost inevitable that someone's going to click on a phishing link and some sort of incident is going to occur. Hopefully, with all your pre-incident planning, you're going to minimize any impact of that incident. But nonetheless, I think it's really important to have the cyber insurance to help you in this type of situation.
And David, you can slide, transition right into it.
No, that's spot on, Cameron. I mean, going back to the theme, that the title of this talk, which is that cyber insurance alone, right, won't be enough, right? It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. It really is two sides of the same coin. It's not a choice between security and insurance, right? As an insurance broker, we're risk advisors. We would never advise clients to skimp on their cybersecurity and to spend that money on premium dollars. I mean, frankly, the underwriters are getting very savvy and understanding where the threats come from and what controls best help mitigate that. So, their underwriting criteria is becoming more stringent. We're not going to be able to get an organization coverage if they don't have the right controls in place. So by all means, spend the money on getting the best security that you can. And the underwriting process can serve as a gut check to help you determine, what moves the needle, what is actually going to give you the best return on your investment. Then recognizing you can never eliminate the threat 100%, then insure that remaining risk, right? That's the responsible way to go about this. So it's a combination of security up front and then insurance essentially as a backstop.
Right, David, and right into the legal, piece, right? Cameron and Sadia, when we talk about, okay, the incident response, we're in the middle of the process now. What kind of value? I know it's a loaded question there.
Sure. No, I think there's lots of areas where a cybersecurity attorney can provide value during the incident response process. And I think, I won't talk about all of them because I can talk forever about that. But really, I think one of the most important aspects is, and to Mike's example, an impacted organization is primarily focused with getting the business back up and running and trying to resolve the immediate threat. And certainly those are very understandable impulses and concerns, but there are also potential legal consequences to the environment or to the incident. And so making sure that you have an attorney there from day one to help try to help you identify what those legal obligations are. And of course, once those obligations are identified, to help you comply with them. There's lots of wiggle room within the law. Some organizations think you have to notify every time. Some organizations think you never have to notify. There's obviously a spectrum, and there's room within that spectrum on what you need to do. And a cybersecurity attorney can really help you comply with your legal obligations while still maximizing maximizing the value to the organization and minimizing the risks to the organization. I think if you don't have cybersecurity attorney there, you're not going to have that value in terms of knowing what to do from a legal standpoint.
Great. Very helpful. Sadia, anything else?
So, I'm going to echo what I said about the cyber insurance, whereas the cyber insurance contacting them kicks off the process, right? Once you have an attorney in place, the term that they use is the breach coach, right? The breach coach helps guide, we almost act as like a project manager, right? Coordinating all of the different vendors, making sure that the incident stays on track all the way through notification and if there's any kind of follow-up inquiry. So that's also the value of the attorney in that role. The attorney fills that spot to make sure that, we're moving along in a timely fashion.
Good. Fantastic. Mike, if we can start with you for the last point there. We're talking about a forensic investigation. Is it needed? Can you just touch briefly on, say, from a technical perspective, a containment position? We talk about containing the incident.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where, when we're engaged in incident response process, the objective is, and one of the first objectives is to contain the incident, make sure that the threat actor has been removed from the environment. And generally in these incidents, the people we're working against will have, once they've gained access to the environment, will have multiple backdoors and ways of getting back in that we need to track down and eliminate. So it's a matter of figuring out how do they get in the first place, and then what systems have they actually touched and accessed, and what tools have they left behind that may allow them to come back. And there's certainly been cases where maybe someone has been ransomwared, and then 2 or 3 months later, that same group has come back in through tools they've actually left behind when they haven't had an effective investigation done to make sure that the environment is properly cleaned.
Terrific. And Kamran, Sadia, before we just move on, because there's a lot here, and I know you guys can talk all day about it. Can you speak to what it's like for an organization to be underprivileged, with counsel, say in a particular investigation? Can you walk us through that a little bit?
Sure. One of the most talked about benefits of having a breach coach involved is having the forensic investigation protected under attorney-client privilege. And typically the way that happens is the attorney will engage the forensic firm on behalf of the client. So in this example, let's say Troutman Pepper would engage Avertium on behalf of the impacted organization. And what that basically does is it creates the premise that the attorney is utilizing the expertise and of the forensic firm to help formulate the legal opinions and conclusions that are going to stem
Great
from
point.
those forensic findings. Now, that there's case law out there that there are circumstances where that privilege can be waived or pierced, so it's not a necessarily automatically everything is automatically privileged. It certainly strengthens the argument that the investigation is privileged, but it's often a misnomer that just because you have legal involved, everything is privileged. There are certain steps that you have to follow, and again, that's why it's important to have an experienced breach coach involved, because they are familiar with that process. They're familiar with those steps, and really what the breach coach is designed to do is really minimize the impact of the incident on the organization, and that's beyond just legal risk. It also helps to maximize or minimize harm to the business from the incident as well.
Great. Thanks, Cameron. I'll pause there. Questions coming in at all?
We had one come in saying, clients are now requiring us to have cyber insurance as well as adhere to data processing, privacy, and protection standards dictated by them to the right to audit. Are there a lot of different quote unquote cyber coverages, or is it just primarily about the limit?
Oh, it is definitely not just about the limits. There are, a variety of insuring agreements that are in what we will call a base form, and then there's some additional enhancements that you can add to a policy by endorsement. There's not a lot of standardization in the wording. So there's, probably a good, I'd say, 40 or more US insurers that provide cyber coverage on a primary basis. And then we throw in the London and Bermuda markets, that could be 60 or 70 total right now. And each one has their own terminology that they use, their own coverage triggers. So it's really important to make sure that you understand what it is that you're purchasing. As far as the data security standards, I'll let our friends from Troutman, comment on that, but I think it's safe to say if you're going to develop a privacy policy to comply with a key customer's requirements, you're going to want to engage counsel around that.
And that leads to the next question. Is there a fine line between reasonable security and true negligence? How is that defined?
I don't think it's defined. And, I think this goes back to the point about there not being, it's not prescribed in the law itself, right? I don't think, courts, I think this is a problem with the law too, that courts really struggle, regulators struggle, right, to figure out what would be reasonable. That's a big issue. I don't even think that a court has necessarily said in the context of a data breach, I don't think a case has gotten to that point where they said this company did not have reasonable security procedures in place. It just hasn't been litigated. My understanding. And so I don't think there's not a clear answer to that question, unfortunately.
And this next question may not have a clear answer either. It sounds like you might make sense to hire a professional to set up prevention stuff, Mike. Any thoughts on what it might cost to implement good preventative measures?
How long is a piece of string? Lots and lots of variables there in terms of the size of the organization, the data you're trying to protect, the complexity of your network and your systems. So yeah, it's a really long, feel free to reach out. Happy to have a chat afterwards about that.
I think that highlights though that one, the security process is a journey, and it's also a lot about risk management, because one, obviously we don't have infinite resources where we can do everything that's state of the art, but also we have to conduct it in a risk management sort of process where we have to prioritize what is going to be the most effective to cover or secure our most prized assets, and then sort of go down the sequence from there. So I think, that's part of the problem as well. Also with respect to reasonable security practices, what's good for one company may not apply to the other. So that's all the more reason to have experts involved, because they can help you answer those questions and manage those risks.
And the attendees do have our contact information for all of these panels.
This reminded me of at least the California AG came out in a report, I think back in 2016, where they, that office gave their opinion that at least baseline security would be following the CIS, what was the top 20 back then. And so they said, that's what they would view as reasonable security. It's the baseline of security. But again, it still goes back to it's going to vary. That's why you can't really answer this question just with one blanket answer because it'll vary business to business in terms of what actually makes sense.
And actually, I might just got one comment there that Cameron sort of mentioned when it comes to risk. One trend I've noticed over the past probably 5 years or so is that we've started seeing the IT security falling and getting more and more aligned with the risk teams. It's some of my early consulting work. Risk was totally focused on your physical buildings and what happens if we have a fire and so forth. And these days we're seeing more and more alignment where risk is actually looking at the cybersecurity component as well. But it still surprises me. It's still fairly often I'll come across firms where IT is responsible for cybersecurity and risk is looking after everything else. But the thing is, the risk teams actually are able to calculate risks and look at cost benefit and things, whereas IT people, we're wonderful at tech stuff. When it comes to actually crunching numbers and things, maybe it is worthwhile actually going and talking to professionals that really know how to do that.
Yeah, I think too. I mean, and David, I'm sure maybe we see it in our business. You have to, if you have great vendors, right? You're paying them a certain amount of money, right? Each month, whatever that premium is for their services, you have to use them. You have to leverage them, leverage their expertise, and I think to shoulder a lot of these responsibilities, whether it's an enterprise risk manager, director of risk and insurance, director of IT, right? Everyone's wearing a lot of hats, and that's a lot to burden. It's just a massive responsibility, whether it's a startup or whether it's just a large organization, very decentralized. Everyone's sitting in their silo. There's a lot there to unpack, and again, it's to leverage the experts around you, the vendors around you, and there's a lot of choices, right? There's a lot of places that organizations can turn to, but you got to lean on them if you have some good ones, and to kind of shepherd that process. And I find a lot of times, unfortunately, even with the insurance, sometimes it's too late. The insurance policy is not framed and structured the way it should be to respond to the actual incident, because it wasn't completely flushed out, say with 2025 insurers. The proper excess policy maybe wasn't in place or overlooked. And everything just can become very disjointed because of all the complexities I'm sure that we all see, inside these organizations.
This is why developing an incident response plan and putting it to the test is so essential, and insurance should have a seat at the table in that process, because you want to make sure that the decisions that you are making are made with an eye towards the coverage. It doesn't mean insurance has to drive the bus, but you want to be in a position to make an informed decision that if you're doing something that may not be covered loss under the policy, that you do that with eyes wide open. And so that process needs to take place. You don't want the first time that risk and IT are talking to each other is after an incident takes place.
Well, I think it speaks to lessons learned too, right? I mean, David, right? We talk about, response to an incident. Dara, was there one more coming in? Yeah, time-wise? Okay. Yeah. We're coming up on about 10 minutes. Let's just, if we can do the time, I want to try to tackle these last 2 points. From a legal perspective, post-incident, what should an organization maybe do, the first couple steps, Kamran and Sadia, that you see? I know we're very limited here.
After the incident, I think, you want to assess what those legal obligations are in terms of notification, in terms of regulatory obligations. Sometimes you have contractual obligations that require notification of the incident. So you definitely want to identify what those legal notification obligations are, what those contractual notification obligations are, and comply with them. But I think beyond that, you also want to focus on minimizing reputational harm to the organization. And one of the ways to do that is to really message the incident. And the timing of that messaging and the content of that messaging is going to vary. But once the incident happens, that's when you should start thinking about, do we want to tell our customers about this incident? If so, what do we want to say? Do we want to only tell a select few? Do we want to tell our employees? So these are sort of non-legal questions and communications that legal can help you with, that I think helps minimize the impact on the business. And I think really maybe the last thing that you want to focus on is, once the incident is contained, once you've complied or identified your notification obligations, is to do that lessons learned sit down with everybody and basically go back. It's another opportunity to test your incident response plan and say, okay, what worked this time? What didn't work? Where did we have gaps? Where did we have areas that, while we laid it out on paper, when we tried to put it into practice, it's just not feasible, didn't work for whatever reason. What can we do to improve things going forward? And you want to update that incident response plan and treat it as a sort of a living document where each iteration gets better and better based on the experience that you have from the prior incidents.
Great. Thanks, Cameron. Sadi, anything else?
No, that covers it.
That's covered it,
It's
good.
it's the saying of don't let a good incident go to waste.
Yeah.
Just make sure you figure out what could have gone better and you update your incident response plan to account for that. So hopefully it doesn't happen again, but probably will.
Probably, yeah.
Probably will.
And Mike, not to put pressure on you here, about a minute.
Yeah.
What you can share with the group from a forensic standpoint, how can you help? How can you help the organization? Obviously, their security posture after the fact.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, first of all, when we're doing the investigation, we're identifying, not just the root cause, but also gaps in the security. We're looking at, okay, do you have, visibility gaps in terms of what's actually happening over your network? And we'll provide suggestions and recommendations as they're identified. Not going to go into too much depth, but we provide as much guidance as we can around that. And then, there's different types of firms out there. Certainly, Avertium is also an MSSP. We have a very large consulting business, and we can help customers sort of look at, okay, where do we go from here? What went wrong? What needs to be fixed? And then, building up that roadmap to try and figure out how to address all those problems.
Thanks, Mike. All right, so kind of coming up on the end here, I'll pause. Dara, any questions at all?
I think we leave the screen up while we answer some of the questions as Mike brought up the roadmap.
Okay.
So one of the questions that came in is, I've worked with a lot of companies over the past few years on security compliance and securing cyber insurance. Market conditions have changed dramatically over the past few years for cyber policies. For example, premiums are up, liability and coverage limits are down, consolidation of providers and carriers, which makes it much more difficult to get the policies underwritten. Can you speak to the changing market conditions and what you see in the trends in the next 1 to 3 years?
Yeah.
And I can piggyback off it too. Yeah.
I'll take a stab at that. I mean, it's difficult to look 1 to 3 years out and know with certainty where this market is going to go. No doubt the past 18 to 24 months has been a hard market. I'm not going to say that it's getting softer right now, but it is stabilizing. Everything that the participants said about the premiums, retention, sublimits, that is all correct. With respect to consolidation, I would note that there are several new entrants in the market. Many of them are what are known as managing general agents. And to put that in very layperson's terms, it means that they are taking the paper from established carriers, but they hold the pen. And so they are, retaining the underwriting and claims expertise, but they are using capital from other firms that don't necessarily want to have that overhead in-house. And they have been very successful in making inroads, particularly in the smaller and middle market account space. So we are seeing some capacity come into the market, and that is helping. But also, the underwriters are getting smarter, and they understand what moves the needle, as I said. They are able to underwrite this risk a little more astutely than in the past, and I believe that their loss ratios are improving, and that's one of the reasons the market's stabilizing.
How is that impacting renewals?
So it is still challenging for renewals. I would say it's not necessarily seeing the middle and high double-digit premium increases that we might have seen 12 months ago, but the underwriters are still very selective. They want to see that you have the right controls in place, and they are pushing back on some of our coverage wish lists with the bells and whistles and different enhancements that we try to negotiate. And, we do our best to differentiate our clients and present them as a better risk so that they can get a better result.
Can someone on the panel speak to HIPAA has fines for various levels of not enough security and or negligence? Can we comment upon that structure?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, again, it goes back to what constitutes reasonable security, but also what constitutes a reasonable response to the security incident. And so as you're going through, if you are a covered entity under HIPAA and you have an incident response, and let's say for whatever reason, you don't conduct a forensic investigation, you don't conduct an analysis of impacted information, you don't comply with your notification requirements, or you do a insufficient job of complying with those requirements, you could put yourself at risk for regulatory fines from HIPAA. It's hard to answer very specifically as to when those fines will come, but in general, if the law doesn't require you to be perfect in your response, the law requires you to be reasonable. And so as long as you have a reasonable and defensible approach, you typically are going to be on the good side of things with respect to fines. But obviously every case is different, and it's something we could certainly talk more about offline if you'd like.
Thanks, Cameron. That's a lot. That's great. Well, I think that brings us to the top of the hour. Perfect. That's what we need. So there's obviously a wealth of expertise at this table. Please reach out to them directly. If you have any questions, you can certainly connect with me and I can put you in touch with the right person. But thank you so much for your time. Look forward to having more of these discussions with all of you, and hope you have a wonderful day.